Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the honor of the first talk. So the title of my talk is Technologies for Making Privacy Violations Transparent and Accountable. But actually, I want to spend a bit of time giving my kind of personal view of privacy, which is something that I've really agonized over the last couple of years, ever since I realized that I wasn't really on the same page as everybody else. I'm going to try and explain what I mean by that in a moment. So really the first two parts here, privacy rights and security obligations and principles for privacy violations, are my attempt to kind of rationalize how I want to think about privacy and the kind of ethical, legal principles around it. Now, I'm not an ethicist and I'm not a lawyer, but I believe there may be some people who have legal and ethical expertise here. So I would very much welcome feedback and discussion about that. Then I get onto the territory that I'm a bit more kind of expert in, which is computer science and applied cryptography and so on. And I hope to at least cover number 3 here, which is about decryption with transparency and accountability. It's a paper I had at the Software Protocols workshop earlier this year. And then if I have time, I'm going to have another kind of technical contribution, which is called Accountable Message Interception, which is a paper I had a couple of years ago. So let me just explain my kind of opinion about privacy and security. So first of all, privacy, I think, is a fundamental human right. And I often try to kind of spell out why that is. Why is privacy so important? And what exactly is important about it. And this is my kind of attempt to do it. So I distinguish here between 3 types of agents that typically violate your privacy. There are governments on the one hand, nation states. Then there are the big corporations that have all this online data about us. And then there's individuals, family, friends, and colleagues. And in each case, it kind of boils down to abuses. Abuses is the reason that we want privacy, because we fear the possibility or the inevitability that incorrect conclusions will be drawn about data about us, and that there can be other kinds of abuses. So for example, from governments, one thing, and perhaps the thing that most fills me with fear when it comes to privacy, is the possibility that we build infrastructure which some future hostile government could abuse. So, you know, right now we kind of have a benign government in the sense that it's democratically elected and so on. Maybe not everything it does, like Brexit, is something that we would want, but we kind of understand why, you know, what's led to it doing those things. But that might not be true in the future. That has not been true in the past. That is not true in other countries. So we should really avoid building infrastructure which could be abused by future governments. Anyway, so those are why, you know, privacy is a human right and why we need it. Now, and by the way, I just want to say, just before I leave that slide, that I'm a kind of avid privacy enthusiast in the sense that I use all those, or many of them, kind of browser extensions like uBlock Origin and Privacy Badger to kind of protect my privacy, and VPNs, for example, to protect privacy from your ISP and so on. But on the other hand, I acknowledge that there is a call to use personal data in order to catch terrorists and other criminals. And we have, for example, in this country, a piece of legislation which many people, and I think including myself, regard as completely appalling, because it allows bulk, by which this means kind of mass. So mass interception of communications and bulk collection of communications data. So as I'm sure you're aware, the first bit there, communications, refers to the content of messages that you send, and the second thing, communications data, refers to the metadata, the to and the from, and the frequency and the timing, and so on. And it also allows targeted and bulk equipment interference, that is, hacking into computers and devices to access their data. And this is a kind of response to end-to-end encryption, because we now have end-to-end encryption on so many platforms, like WhatsApp, like Signal. And therefore intercepting communications is no longer as interesting as it used to be, and therefore you have to target the endpoints. That's what that second inner bullet point is about. Now, allegedly, legislation of this kind has foiled a certain number of terrorism attempts and led to a certain number of convictions. Of course, it's hard for us to evaluate those claims because we don't know what those numbers are. We can't look at the details because it's confidential. But those are the claims anyway. And here's a little quote from NSA Chief Keith Alexander. There's no other way to protect Americans than to collect billions of phone and internet records. Now, I don't know what to make of that. It just seems to me that with quotes like that and with legislation like that and with the huge initiative that is around this idea that if we collected more information about people, we could somehow stop terrorism, I personally don't think we can just kind of ignore that or outright deny it, although I completely accept that, as I mentioned already, the asymmetry of the debate makes it very hard to evaluate. And I think the response to it I have is summarized in this final bullet point, and that's really what this talk is about. There is, in my opinion, insufficient transparency about the quantity and nature of these privacy violations and of the outcomes. So what I'd like to have is that society as a whole, if we are to have legislation like this, society as a whole gets to have transparency about how much of their data is being analyzed, in what ways, and for what outcomes. And by outcomes, I mean, well, if this is meant to lead to foiling of plots and convictions, then, well, what are those outcomes? Can they be attributed to this kind of legislation, to invoking this kind of legislation? So, as I see it, then, there are there's a requirement to balance these two things. And if you need further conviction that it's something like balancing two kind of opposing things, it seems to me that just conducting the thought experiments in which you imagine what a world would be like if security trumped privacy every time, or if privacy trumped security every time, well, both of those worlds are undesirable, in my opinion. We can't live in either of those worlds. Now, the left world is one that's kind of well known in literature, so to speak. You know, the novel 1984, which was written in 1948, is about that left world in which our lives are monitored in all aspects. There's CCTV in every bedroom, in every bathroom, and every room, but including bedrooms and bathrooms. Big Brother controls all communication channels. And of course, in the future, we will have brain interfaces. Nobody could doubt that. And those will also be controlled by Big Brother in this kind of totalitarian surveillance world. So that world is a horrible world that we quite well understand because of novels like 1984. But I think the other world is also a horrible world. And I've tried to spell out what I think the world might be like if privacy trumped security every time. In that world, everything is private. So all payments, for example, are made with not Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is not so anonymous, but with the successors of Bitcoin, which will have better anonymity properties. And for that reason, no one pays tax. And for that reason, there is no state. No one can be held accountable for their actions. Crimes can effectively be committed because you have full privacy. You're not seen by anyone, and therefore there's no fear of repercussions. And then you have a world in which there are super wealthy asset owners that control everything but are unaccountable to anybody and act with impunity, and no one knows who owns what. And that's also a horrible world, because I think that what that world doesn't have is a feeling which is very intuitive and important to me, and that is that we live in a society in which we are accountable, and we have to be accountable to each other. How else could society work? So to me, both of those worlds are undesirable. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this kind of philosophy bit, especially as I'm not an expert in it, but I want to just say a few more words about it. So I used to think it kind of was like this. Because of the reasons I've been giving, you know, there's kind of individual privacy on the one hand, and then societal security, and they have to be kept in balance. But recently, I've been working with lawyers in our university, and in fact, we've just proposed an outline project, which is under review at the moment with them in this area about privacy. And I've learned from lawyers that they have a different story. And this slide is my attempt to reconstruct their story, which I find quite appealing and intuitive. And it starts with the idea that this right to privacy, which we all kind of intuitively find appealing, is actually just one right among many. There are other rights as well, of course. I mean, and here's some of the ones that you might look on the Wikipedia page as I did. The right to life, the right to liberty, pursuit of happiness, free expression, due process of law, freedom of association. Actually, there are hundreds of these rights in lots of areas, and they're classified in lots of ways, and different kind of articles, like the US Constitution or the European documents on human rights, detail them in different ways. Now, security comes in because you can't, these rights are meaningless. You can't exercise your rights unless there is security in the world. I mean, what else does it mean to have the right to life unless there is a police force that is defending your right to life? Security exists in order to protect rights. Rights legitimize security. But of course, these rights are conflicting with each other. So the way I see it, because my right, for example, to privacy might conflict with your right to life when it comes to taking an aircraft. Because if my right to privacy means I'm not going to reveal what's inside my luggage, then that's threatening your right to life, because the possibility that I might be carrying a bomb or something. So the way this kind of view sees it is that rights are the fundamental thing, and the tension exists between, for example, your rights and my rights. And security is a kind of secondary thing. It is merely the mechanism by which these rights are protected. So I'm curious to know, and I would welcome people who know more about this than I do, telling me their opinion about this as the day goes on, in coffee breaks and so on. OK, so having kind of given you my opinion about privacy rights and security obligations, I want to just come to what I think are, if we are to have privacy violations, which I think is inevitable, that there will be privacy violations, what kind of principles should underlie them? And I start with the first two principles that are well known, necessity and proportionality. Namely, if I'm to violate your privacy, it should be necessary, that whatever purpose I have should make it necessary for me to violate your privacy. And the means that I'm taking should be proportional to the objectives I'm trying to achieve. So those are well established in law. Now I want to motivate two further properties, which I want to detail here. The first is transparency, and the second is accountability. So by transparency, I mean that when privacy rights are violated, the violation should be recorded and should be observable by everyone in some sense. I'll come to the sense in a moment. And also, not only the violation is observable, but the benefits that arise from such violations, those also are visible. So both the act of violating and the outcome of violating should be visible to everyone, including the person whose privacy, of course, is being violated. Now, an important part of this transparency, and what I think makes it interesting from a technical perspective, is that transparency should not just be the word of an individual, like the Commissioner for Interception. There is somebody who has that title in the UK, who writes a report every year saying, OK, well, we had certain invocations of these various acts of parliament that allow us to intercept communications and so on. But they weren't too big, and necessity and proportionality was observed in every case. And he signs a document of a few hundred pages saying that. But we would just have to accept that. Now, on my view, transparency would not be just having to accept the word of somebody who gets to access this information, but it would be something that users, citizens like us, can verify. So it involves building in cryptographic protocols, which means that you can verify the veracity of these transparency reports. That's quite difficult to do. But I want to detail how that would work when I come to the technical part of my talk. But the second thing I want to mention about transparency is that transparency might not be fine-grained, because there is this idea that you have to protect the confidentiality of operations. So for example, if it's about decrypting information, and that's a big case study I want to come to, then it might not tell you the individual messages that were decrypted, but rather just the quantity or proportion of messages that were decrypted. Because if we tell you the individual messages, this might alert people to the fact that they are under observation. So transparency might be quite coarse-grained, and that's the sense in which violations are recorded and observable, but not necessarily at a fine grain. It may be at a coarse grain in the sense of quantities rather than individual violations. Okay, and the second principle that I wanted to add is kind of just derived from this transparency, and it says that when privacy rights are violated, the violators have the opportunity, so to speak, and if they're democratically elected officials, then they will presumably take the opportunity to explain their reasons. So by that I mean that the whole question of how much intrusion into people's private lives, this could become a matter of political discourse. So just, yet another of the many things we take into account when we go to the polling station. Okay, so I want to just at least get through my first kind of technical contribution here, and perhaps not the second, because I spent quite a lot of time on that intro. And it's trying to put these principles and these ideas about privacy and security into effect. So it's about decryption with transparency and accountability. So it could be applied in a great many situations. So here are three of the situations that I have in mind. The first is the surveillance system known as Transport for London Oyster card. So it is, primarily a surveillance system. And by the way, it was a few years ago that I came across an article in theregister.co.uk that said MI5 and MI6 have asked for unrestricted access to the TfL database. So they have asked for. It was just a news story saying that they have requested unrestricted access. That was in about 2007 or 8 that I saw that report. Since then, I've done many Google searches to find out the outcome of this request. Were they granted or were they not granted unrestricted access to the TfL database? And I have not been able to find the answer to that. It just doesn't seem to be known or reported anywhere. So I guess we have to assume that MI5 and MI6 do have unrestricted access to the Oyster card and, database and can therefore go fishing in it. And that's a privacy violation that's totally against the principles that I've outlined there, against the principles of necessity and proportionality, and of course the principle of transparency, because they can just access any of this data to figure out, who might be committing a crime. So the Oyster card system as it exists at the moment is a horribly privacy invasive system. And the mechanism that I want to outline now, actually in the project that I mentioned that we're proposing, we're going to use the Oyster card system as the case study to see if we can develop a system which would give you, or give governments rather, the ability to access this data for the purposes of crime and terrorism prevention, and yet give citizens transparency about how much of their privacy is being intruded upon. So I think that's a good one to focus on in the story that I now tell, but I think you could also focus on email. That's also a battleground for privacy, of course, and financial data and accesses, payments, and so on. That's obviously also a battleground for privacy and security. So I want to ask you now to imagine the following scenario. You have a system which creates data. So here I've talked about users creating data. So let's think specifically in terms of the Transport for London thing. Users are creating this data about their traveling. That's the first bullet point. But now I'm saying they're encrypting it with a certain public key PK. And there is a decrypting agent, Y. So let's imagine now the decrypting agent is some government service that is trying to track crime and so on. And it's capable of decrypting the ciphertext without any help from the users. So it has, if you like, full access to the information because it can decrypt any of those ciphertexts. But when Y decrypts ciphertexts, it unavoidably creates evidence, which I call E, that is accessible to those users, to the passengers. That evidence can't be suppressed or discarded without detection. So that would mean that if we could achieve this, and I'm going to outline how to achieve this, that would mean that you travel the London Oyster card through with the Oyster card. You create this data. It can be accessed. So there's no concern about governments that this data can't be accessed, because it can. But you get to see to what extent that access is being invoked by looking at this evidence E. So that's the kind of principle here. So how could we achieve such a thing? Well, the first observation is that in pure cryptography, and by the way, I don't really know how much, of course I know it's a mix here. There will be some people who probably know much more cryptography than I do, and some people who probably know much less. But anyway, I think it's intuitive that in pure cryptography, you could not achieve what I just described in the previous slide. Because if Y has a ciphertext and a decryption key, it's impossible to detect whether she applies the key to the ciphertext or not. And therefore, the decryption key has to be guarded by some kind of hardware device which can't be corrupted. So in the end, what this paper that I'm describing now, which I had in a workshop earlier this year, what it asks is, what is a minimal specification for such a device that has the desired properties? Now, I've deliberately tried to formulate that in a very application-agnostic way, because I think that those requirements that I outlined there on the previous slide, those requirements apply in a great many circumstances, not just to the Oyster card, but to email and financial data and all kinds of other data as well. So what is the minimal specification for a device that would have those desired properties? I'll detail it just a little bit in a few minutes, but I'm aware that I'm running out of time. The core idea is that there's a log. So think of, if you like, of a distributed ledger like the Bitcoin blockchain, or if you happen to know Google's proposal for a thing called certificate transparency, a public key certificate log that Google is maintaining, that actually is a better analog for this. But there's some kind of log in which decryption requests are recorded. But like the Bitcoin log and the certificate transparency log, this log has certain features in that the log maintainer can produce proofs about the way it's maintaining the log. So there are these two crucial proofs here. It can produce a proof, and by proof I mean cryptographic data which has all the properties of a proof. Namely, you can't produce it unless the thing you're proving is true, and the verifier is able to kind of verify that and get a sound and complete answer about whether it's true or not. So it's a proof that some data is in the log, and a proof that the log is being maintained in an append-only way. So the idea is that if this agent Y that wants to make a decryption, what it has to do is it has to first insert its request into this append-only log, and then get from the log these proofs that it's done that, and then present those proofs to the device D. So here in this middle arrow here, you see the decrypting agent sending the request and those two proofs that it's inserted the request into the log. And this device does a very simple thing. The design of the device is meant to be really optimal so that it's very, very small code. It simply verifies these proofs, which is a small piece of code, and then performs the decryption, because it's now satisfied that the decryption request is in the log, and then sends that back to the decrypting agent. And the idea is that it only decrypts if the request is in the log. And that's what gives the transparency, because users can inspect the log and see what's in the log or not. Now, the granularity of this, whether you can see individual requests or just quantities of requests and so on, that is, you can configure that in a number of different ways according to the application that you have in hand. But the core idea is that you can only that the device will only decrypt things that are in the log, and users can see how many things there are in the log. So in fact, it boils down to a device with actually two protocols. So far, I just showed you one on the previous slide. The one I showed you is the one where it does the decryption, because it's verified evidence that the thing is in the log, and outputs the result. But if you think about it, there's a requirement for another protocol, and that is a protocol which essentially guarantees that the log that the device sees and the log that users see is the same log. Otherwise, there's a risk that the maintainer could bifurcate the log and show you a benign log, while actually there's a much more privacy-invasive log that the device sees. So you've got this extra protocol to ensure that you see the same version of the log as the device does. OK, so as I kind of anticipated, I kind of got to the end of my time slot without giving the second part of my talk. So I'm going to... are you sure that's fine? Because... OK, well, OK, Andrea is also... OK, well, I'm going to take another 5 minutes then. And thank you very much for being generous. So, well, I only have 2 more things to say, really. This additional contribution and then my conclusions. So this additional contribution is an effort to kind of refine these ideas a bit more. It's a little bit strange, actually, because this paper I published in 2017, and then the paper that refines it a bit more is prior to that. But I realized that some prior work was needed, so to speak. It's trying to make it work a bit better for the second application. So if I just go back here, where I talked about these applications, what we've seen so far works very well if the data is encrypted with a single key, and the only circumstances in which you would decrypt the data is to do these privacy violations. So it works for this case, because the data has no value. You know, you've taken your journey and everything's done. The only reason you'd want to decrypt it is if you wanted to investigate some crime or something. But the situation with email is different. In the situation for email, I write you a message, and now there are 2 reasons why the message should be decrypted. One is because you wish to read the message, so you must have a key to decrypt the message to read it. And the other is that some authority might want to intercept the message, and they might want to read it. So they must have a key to decrypt it as well. And that key, their key, is one that we want the transparency over. But we don't want the transparency over your key, because that's your private business. You can decrypt as much as you want, and there's no requirement to log those decryptions. But if this other third-party agent wants to decrypt, then we want to be able to log their decryptions. So that's what motivates this second contribution here, which is accountable message interception. Now, I just want to say, before I mention accountable message interception, I want to mention, no, I think I'll just go straight on to that. So let me talk about accountable message interception, where you have these 2 keys. Well, essentially, the idea is to make message interception transparent and accountable, a message sender needs to encrypt a message, as I mentioned, needs to encrypt their message data such that it can be decrypted either by the intended recipient, who has a certain key that they want to decrypt it with, or by this escrow holder. And in the second case, decryptions by the escrow holder are the ones that we want to log using this device that I mentioned and things like that. So how do we achieve that? Well, the way we do it is we use some cryptography which is based on El-Gamal cryptography. So I'm going to just make the assumption that you know a little bit about how El-Gamal works. And I want to just briefly describe how this system works. So in this system, Alice is going to select a custodian. So a custodian is going to be the agent that's able to decrypt, the escrow agent that's able to decrypt. And by the way, she can select a set of them. That makes it even more secure from her point of view, because she doesn't have to trust an individual custodian, but rather a set. And that means that if any of them is honest, then she will have her privacy respected. So she computes the custodian's public key, and she chooses her private key. And then she kind of makes a version of her public key, which a certificate authority then further randomizes and publishes a certificate over this kind of joint public key. Now, I know that this is very cryptographic, and I know that some people won't understand the kind of notation here. So I'm just going to emphasize that the final public key, which is the one certified by this certificate authority, is a key that allows somebody to encrypt in such a way that it can be decrypted by Alice or decrypted by the custodian. And it has the additional property that it's kind of enforced escrow. So once this key has been certified, an encryptor can't derive a pure public key for Alice out of this key. He can only derive, any encryption that he does which is decryptable by Alice is also decryptable by the custodian. So that way we have this property of escrow, and then thanks to the previous talk where you have this, the previous kind of part of my talk, where you have this log and the decrypting device, you have accountability of the escrow agent. So for that reason, I think that you kind of have a good system for message interception, because Alice can't avoid the possibility of interception, but if there is interception, then she has full transparency and accountability over how that works. OK, so that was the second contribution. So now let me come to the conclusions. So my first conclusion is a kind of summary of my opinion about privacy, which is that it is a fundamental right, but even as a fundamental right, it's not an absolute right. And we have to build infrastructure which will enable us to get transparency and accountability for privacy violations. We can't just allow privacy to trump every other desired property, but where we do have privacy violations, which I think are inevitable, we must have transparency and accountability over how they work. And as I mentioned, that comes in two parts. And I've only really scratched the surface of the first one. So the first one is making violations observable. I've mentioned some approaches in this talk. The second one, which I didn't talk about at all, is making the outcomes visible. So it seems to me that if we are to violate people's privacy, there's a purpose for doing that. And we must make sure that the purpose is being satisfied. It's kind of part of this necessity argument. It was necessary, and the proof that it was necessary is in part that it achieved certain arrests or achieved certain foilings of terrorism plots or whatever it might be. Now, other people have worked on that, so I'm just briefly mentioning there that this concept, for example, of private set intersection, which would allow you, for example, to figure out that if you violated the privacy of these 1,000 individuals here, and then later you made kind of 1,000 arrests, well, a big question is, what is the intersection of those two sets? How many of the people whose privacy you violated actually then went on to becoming people that got arrested? Because if that number is high, it sort of adds legitimacy to the privacy violation. And if that number is low, it does not add legitimacy. It looks like you violated the privacy of a whole bunch of people. It turned out that they were all completely innocent, so you went on to arrest some other people. So the question of how big the intersection between these sets are is a big part of making the outcomes visible. Now, I haven't worked on that, but there is work on that, and that I just mentioned it there in brackets. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for overrunning by a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Mark. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
So I didn't quite see the difference between the TFL case and the email case, because in TFL, the users still need to see the data of their records. For example, there is a system there where you can kind of look at and get receipts or whatever. You can see where you've travelled yourself. So there is actually a system there where whatever is being logged, perhaps not indefinitely, but whatever is being logged, you can go to a machine and find out as a user yourself. So am I missing something about that?
Right.
The other thing, metadata you can learn an awful lot from, we kind of know that.
Yep.
And this is setting up a metadata system for the users. So I kind of have this vague worry of how on earth can you do it without the metadata you're logging being enough for them to know everything they need to know and run for the hills.
Okay.
If they really are criminals or a terrorist organisation or whatever it is that's being investigated. So could you, comment on that.
Okay, well, let me comment on those two. So the first one, I think that the difference between the TFL and the email is that, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, you get to look at your own Oyster data usage, but that's not, so there's, that could be handled in a number of ways. It could just be stored locally on your card, for example. In other words, it's not a communication between you and another person. It's a communication between you and yourself. And there's a number of ways of handling that, I think, that, well, for example, just storing it locally on the card or something like that. So the crucial difference is that an email message is a communication between you and another person, and that makes it a bit more complicated. Now, then you mentioned metadata, and there's a number of things I could say about that, but I don't have any very good answers. Certainly, from an email point of view, the system is all about just hiding the content. It makes no effort to hide the metadata, and hiding metadata of these kinds of messaging protocols is really hard. I find it quite interesting that, you know, so we have WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, and a year or maybe a year and a half ago, WhatsApp introduced end-to-end encryption on WhatsApp. And that's great in a way. You know, your messages are automatically encrypted, and you don't even need to do anything. It just every user is getting that kind of automatically for free. So that does sound great, but as you point out, what's really of interest to these companies is not the content data, but the metadata. And at the same time as introducing this end-to-end encryption, Facebook also introduced a system whereby if you continue to use WhatsApp, you've got to tell Facebook your telephone number. In other words, they get to hugely increase their ability to analyze the metadata, namely who you know and who you send messages to, with what frequency, and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is a huge problem that I didn't address at all in my talk. So thank you for highlighting it. The problem of metadata, I mean.
I was just wondering how your solutions tie in with the debate around end-to-end encryption and backdoors that the government is so keen on. I appreciate metadata is probably more valuable, and what they're not really saying is actually they can get that, but where would it tie in with the content aspect?
Right. So the big point I want to make in my talk is that I accept that we have to have privacy violations, but they have to be transparent. Backdoors are the complete opposite of that. You know, backdoors are, as the name suggests, you know, an opaque, non-transparent way of doing privacy violations. And as such, I'm completely against backdoors and completely against what this Act of Parliament calls equipment interference, which is hacking into your computer in order to get your data before it gets encrypted or after it's been decrypted. You know, I think that as a society, we just have to, in one sense, kind of grow up and accept that privacy is not absolute, but in another sense, you know, grow up and realize that we can't have secret laws or secret procedures of the kind exposed by Edward Snowden, but we need to have transparency. You know, I need to know what the rules are. I need to know that when I send a message, there is a possibility that it will be decrypted, but I get to see, as a member of society as a whole, you know, what quantity of decryptions actually take place. You know, so it does seem to me that if you look at that Oyster card thing and you think, okay, so I know that, you know, my journey may be monitored, but I get to see that only 1% of journeys are monitored. Now, that kind of bulk figure, it might actually be all of my journeys, because I might be a suspect, but it's 1% across the population as a whole. That, to me, is some assurance. And you certainly cannot have that assurance with backdoors or any other kind of opaque mechanism, and therefore I'm against such mechanisms.
Thanks. Do you have any specific proposals for what if there are multiple entities decrypting? Because obviously there is a state in one country, there is a state in another country, and they both want to decrypt WhatsApp messages. So does it matter if this and this decrypt the same 1% or a different 1% and then share the results?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm very aware that that's a really difficult aspect of any kind of interception, any kind of monitoring, that you have different states involved. I'm going to cop out of your question and say, no, I don't have any particular. I mean, I've had some thoughts about it, but I haven't got anything mature enough to warrant giving you an answer.
Thank you. I think this is more a bit of observation than, or maybe comments. With TSA, for example, if you travel to the US, if you have your suitcase padlock, you should put TSA lock, otherwise they might break your lock and things like that. So in a sense, it's quite similar to what you propose here. The government agents can actually open your lock and look into your luggage and things like that, and they usually leave a note after they happened to me a few times. Now, there seems to be some acceptance of that now, so people just, okay, happily, okay, if I want to go to the US, I know I have to just do that, and we accept that. Do you think this is something, with regard to what you're proposing here, is something that ordinary citizens, people, will find it more acceptable, or there are ways to make it acceptable for them?
So the one big distinction that I would make between what I'm proposing and TSA is that this is transparent. I mean, when you were describing TSA there, you said they usually leave a note. But of course, they might not leave a note. The other problem that people have had with TSA is that these keys are floating around everywhere. Many people have a TSA key even though they've got no business to have one. So, in fact, in that sense, I think TSA has been a bit of a failure because it gives you very little security and it gives you no transparency about who opened your suitcase. So that's the distinction I want to make here. This is about you having complete oversight, you having oversight of how much decryption is used. Now, how complete is that oversight? So it must be complete. It must be complete. How fine-grained it is, I agree, that's a kind of very debatable thing. I would like it to be very fine-grained, but I can imagine that people who are involved in security operations are going to say that it shouldn't be fine-grained. They only want to give kind of summary data. But I want this summary data to be completely verifiable. So people might know this is the field of electronic voting. In electronic voting, the idea that you cast your vote on across the internet or something, one of the big principles behind that is that anyone should be able to verify the outcome of the election. The election should be completely transparent. There should be a complete account of how the result of the election was computed. And you do that with homomorphic encryption and mixed nets and various other technologies. So that's the kind of motivation for this work. I want the same sort of technologies, zero-knowledge proofs and so on, to be used here so that you get a complete story of how the privacy violations unfolded.
Anyone else?
Hi. Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask first, the outcomes should be observable by anybody or only by the users that provide their data?
Yes, but, that's a good question, actually. I think summary outcomes should be observable by everybody, but fine-grained outcomes might be only observable by... Oh, I see. These outcomes here, you mean? These outcomes?
Yeah.
No, I think it should be observable by everybody. Do you have any example in mind?
One comment is that if somebody is a false positive necessarily, and people observe that he's a false positive, I mean, he didn't do anything wrong, but he is always under investigation, then this may be also a violation of his own privacy.
Yes, yes, yes. So I was thinking here it would just be the numbers are visible. So when I talked about set intersection, I was thinking that you would have numbers, but not individuals. So you would know that 1,000 people had their privacy violated, and then a certain number got arrested, and but you don't know the individuals in any of these sets. You know that it was a set of size 1,000, another set of size 1,000. The intersection had a certain size, but you don't know any individuals' names. That's the way I see that working.
So this becomes a mechanism to control the mining model, essentially. Say if there are a lot of cases where the outcomes are not correct, then we should change the algorithm by which we mine this knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's my intuition.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.